In any debate, if you are on the negative, then disadvantages are your bread and butter. You should never enter into a policy debate without some idea of a disadvantage you are going to run. But beginning debaters often find themselves stuck when trying to compose a well-developed disadvantage. The first step is learning what are the stock issues for a disadvantage, and if you haven't learned what those stock issues are, then you should complete that lesson first. But that one lesson is not enough. People don't compose disadvantages every day, so the activity is foreign to them. Therefore, a good idea is to get familiar with some generic disadvantages in order to see some tested disadvantages. Therefore, this lesson will go over 3 common disadvantages that occur regularly in debates. The following disadvantages occur so regularly because they are relevant or link to so many cases. Remember, the assumption is that you have already completed the disadvantages lesson earlier, so there will be jargon in this lesson that was covered in the previous lesson. The first common disadvantage is called federalism, and it is a very American argument. In fact, arguments about federalism began with the American Constitution and have not stopped since. The essential argument is that a free society requires a very careful balance of government power and individual freedom, and that the affirmative team throws off that balance with their advocacy. Here's the breakdown. The first stock issue is uniqueness, and typically this covers the 10th Amendment of the Constitution. You see, the amendment says that the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. Basically, this means that if the Constitution doesn't explicitly say that the federal government has the power to do something, then it's the states that are in charge of the issue in question. You might also include some evidence about the success of states to solve important problems, especially if that evidence is relevant to the topic of debate. For instance, if the resolution is about education, and the uniqueness evidence should be related to education. The next issue is the length, and the Federalism DA is most applicable when the affirmative is running a case for nationwide reform for education, health, and other welfare policies. It doesn't work so well for topics like national security or foreign relations, so a good rule of thumb is to only run federalism arguments on domestic topics. The next issue is the internal link, and this is where things can get tricky. At this point in the disadvantage, the goal is to set up your impacts. One of the most popular arguments is to explain why this violation of federalism will open the door for abuses of power. For instance, if the topic is the United States federal government should substantially reform education in the United States, then the internal link argument should be that the federal control over education could give the government the ability to select appropriate materials. Such a power is easily abused by any politician that happens to work his or her way into a position of power. For example, people recently accused a Texas school board of choosing history books for political reasons rather than choosing the highest quality. Imagine one organization dictating what millions of students are forced to read. This leads to the impact, which is typically tyranny. The earliest of debates between Federalists and Anti-Federalists were steeped in what was the best strategy to avoid tyranny, because the people who fought the Revolutionary War were very skeptical of powerful governments. But you can also argue that federalism promotes public engagement because the governments are closer to the people, and that federalism promotes innovative solutions to problems because we get numerous laboratories of democracy developing a variety of strategies. Similar to the Federalism DA is politics. The politics DA basically states that even the best of intentions will encounter political opposition and might result in unintended consequences. The uniqueness point typically introduces a political situation, like there is an immigration bill that is soon to pass, or that there is an election cycle coming up. It might seem odd because the political situation in the uniqueness oftentimes doesn't seem to be relevant to the topic at all, but the link isn't so much about what the plan is, as it is passing any plan tends to upset one's political opponents. The internal link describes what these political opponents do in response to the passage of the plan. So in response to sweeping educational reform, the opponents to reform push hard to kill immigration. This might sound a little childish, and it is, But in debate terms, many people like to explain that politics is a zero-sum game, or that for every winner, there is a loser. So the opponents will be extra motivated to chalk up a win after a loss. This is supported by the trend that whichever party wins the presidential election tends to lose elections 2 years later during the midterms. Regardless, the impacts that follow stem from whatever you selected in the internal link. So if the disadvantage focus on immigration reform, then the impacts are all the families that continue to suffer. If the disadvantage focuses on the environment, then the impact might be that the Alaskan National Wildlife Reserve will be exploited for resources. The options are nearly infinite, which makes the politics disadvantage exceptionally customizable and really unpredictable. The last generic disadvantage of this lesson is known as masking. Masking is a good disadvantage when you are struggling to develop a disadvantage because the fundamental argument is that the affirmative only appears to be solving the problem, and that the appearance of solvency results in people being less diligent and therefore makes the problem worse by pushing it underground. So, in order, the uniqueness argument typically requires that the debater point out alternate causes to whatever the problem is. So, for the education case, the problem might be the falling test scores of the United States students, and the plan could be to include public pre-kindergarten for all children. The negative has ample ability to argue that there are several things that influence education scores other than pre-K. Things like teacher pay, class sizes, emphasis on the arts, just to name a few. The link would then argue that this plan will be heralded as a good thing, and you might even see a difference in test scores. But it is the perception that education was fixed that is important. This is because it is the perception that education was fixed that will lead to the internal link, which is people losing focus on how to improve education in our country. And they will find comfort in believing that the affirmative has solved the problem already. Specifically, people suffering from poverty will probably continue to perform poorly on tests because their living conditions will be a bigger influence than one extra year of education. Debaters need skill when explaining the impact because it still sounds like the plan has a net advantage to the status quo. The impact is that all the suffering left in place after the plan is passed is compounded year after year because society ignores the problems that remain. In other words, the plan condemns the poor to years of continued suffering just so we can marginally increase test scores. If you find yourself regularly participating in debate tournaments, then you are likely to run into these disadvantages several times. They are common for a reason. They apply to a lot of topics and have a long history. Federalism is a signature American debate. Politics are an ever-present force in government, and some degree of masking happens with any plan. The goal should be to craft custom disadvantages depending on the topic you are given, but that is sometimes difficult. These disadvantages give a nice foundation for any beginning debater to experiment with. And even if you ultimately fall out of favor with any of the previous disadvantages, being familiar with them makes it easier to anticipate responses when you are on the receiving end.